Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but you are in the right place for the digital dialogue. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. There's still people rolling in. Welcome to those who are just joining us. We're going to just give it 2 more minutes and we'll get rolling at 5:35. Welcome. We're glad you're here. For those of you who've just joined us, we'll be getting going in just a second here. Welcome. Okay, welcome everyone. You are in the right spot for the digital dialogue series, Co-Learning to Build a Good Food System. We typically offer full Spanish translation or interpretation, sorry, for these series. We are having technical difficulties at the moment, so we're going to try to work on those, and hopefully we'll be able to offer that momentarily. But we're glad you're here. And my name is Molly Reardon. I am the Good Food Purchasing Coordinator for the City of Philadelphia, Department of Public Health's Division of Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention. Our division believes that all people should live to their fullest potential in environments that allow them to grow and thrive, and that progress only happens when we treat all people with dignity, care, and respect. As part of its efforts, my division works toward creating healthy, sustainable, fair local food systems, or what we call a good food economy, and acknowledges that dismantling systems of oppression is foundational to achieving our vision of a just food system. Tonight is the last in a series of 6 conversations with community and civic leaders whose work reimagines our food system in Philadelphia and in cities across the country to answer the question, what does it take to build a good food system for all right now at this point in time? These digital dialogues showcase good food economy work that includes anti-racist strategies and inspires all of us to envision and work toward an equitable food system. This series is a partnership with the Free Library of Philadelphia's Division of Cultural and Civic Engagement. And I would like to thank my co-organizer, the peerless Susanna Erminska, exhibitions curator at the division, for her brilliance and drive in creating this series. It's been a fabulous partnership between public health and the library. And I'm really proud to have worked with Susanna on this series. And as always, Susanna will be managing technology. So if you have any tech issues or other issues that might be able to be mediated by Zoom, you can get in touch with Susanna in the chat. Funding for the series comes from the Sodium Reduction in Communities program of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, and from the Free Library. This event was originally scheduled as an in-person event at the Heim Center for Civic and Cultural Engagement, which has provided for Spanish interpretation tonight and every night, so long as we can get it working. And if you'd like to watch previous sessions from this series, you can check out our website, which is foodfitphilly.org/goodfoodsystems. And I will put that in the chat during our conversation this evening. So we shifted tonight's program by a few weeks in order to take a look back at 2020 and to look ahead at what it will take to achieve an equitable and environmentally thriving food system going forward. And if change starts at home, then we decided to bring it back to the state of Pennsylvania and our regional food shed for a conversation with change makers in our own backyard. Tonight's guests' work bridge urban and rural and proves that the cultural and economic and ecological diversity of our region isn't just an asset, it's the foundation for stronger bonds between producers and consumers. So with that, I'd love to introduce our speakers. Dr. Talia Young is a visiting assistant professor in the Environmental Science Department at Haverford College and the founder and director of Fishadelphia, a youth-centered community seafood program based in Philadelphia. Talia studies fishing and seafood in order to improve the conservation, management, and resilience of aquatic species and the human communities that depend on them. A former high school teacher, Talia's teaching and research on the connection between fish and people underpins work to build an intersectional conservation movement. Sara Nicholas is a policy strategist for PASA Sustainable Agriculture, whose mission is to cultivate environmentally sound, economically viable, and community-focused farms and food systems in Pennsylvania. Sara has worked most recently as policy director for Pennsylvania's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and has done field work in forestry, stream restoration, and riparian buffer planting. At PASA, her policy work focuses on ways to improve soil health, economic and environmental sustainability, and conservation generally. Talia, welcome. Sara, welcome. I'm so thrilled that you're both here tonight. Talia, I'd like to start with you. And I know that you have some images to share with us. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about yourself and about Fishadelphia.
Great, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to try a screen share, we'll see if it works, so that I can illustrate talking about a little bit about me and a little bit about Fishadelphia. How's that on video and how's that on audio?
Perfect on both.
Great, awesome. So I grew up in New York City, not too far from here. And I was the kind of kid who joined the environmental club in middle school and spent much of my middle school days sorting paper in the recycling bin when you still had to do that. But at some point, I began wondering why we were doing all this work to save the rainforest that we'd never been to, and why we were spending time on frogs and whales when there were so many obvious pressing social problems closer to home. And so I got interested in fish because fish is a place where it makes sense to talk about the environment and about people at the same time. So this is by the famous fish-themed artist, Ray Troll. No fish, no fisherman. And so I really like fish. And so I went to grad school and I got a degree studying fish. And then while I was doing that, it turned out that I'm also interested in people. So so it turns out, oh no, wait, you're not supposed to go. Okay. So it turns out that if you work with fish and you like people, one thing that you can do is get involved with people who fish in fishing communities. And so I began to get involved with some people working with fishing communities and came to learn more about some of the struggles there, like trying to find viable domestic markets for sustainably caught local fish. And so I began to think about how I could contribute here. So I often tell this story about being at a local seafood conference, and there was a fisherman who got up and said, "Americans only know how to eat cod and salmon fillets, and we need to teach them how to eat other kinds of fish." And I remember thinking to myself, I don't think you're talking to the right Americans. So I shop at the Whole Foods. This is from the Whole Foods up on Callow Hill. But I also shop in Chinatown, and the seafood counters look pretty different in these places. And so, I don't know, I guess before Fishadelphia, I didn't cook a ton of seafood at home. I do now. But certainly when eating it out in Chinese restaurants, whatever, everybody likes cod and salmon fillets. No, there's no objection to cod and salmon fillets, but also lots of other fish, whole fish, crabs, lobsters, clams, jellyfish, abalone, sea cucumber. And it's not just us. So my Black American friends eat a lot of seafood, salmon and cod for sure, but also crabs and clams and squid and whole fish. And the people in my life who eat the most seafood and know the most about it happen to all be people of color. So sure, I know a lot of people who eat cod and salmon fillets only, but it's certainly not all Americans. And so I began to wonder what would happen if we connected seafood harvesting communities with culturally and economically diverse eating communities. Could this be win-win for everybody? Could this provide new local markets for small-scale seafood harvesters and high-quality fresh food for consumers? So I wrote a couple of proposals, and then they got funded, and then you have to do it. Right? So then I was like, okay, I guess we're going to do this project. So Fishadelphia was born. So we bring seafood, fresh seafood harvested, or in some shellfish cultivated on the Jersey Shore into Philadelphia. And the mission is to provide high quality, fresh seafood to culturally and economically diverse consumers at reasonable prices while paying at or higher than market prices to our harvesters. So there's the idea. But then something else to know about Fishadelphia, I have to get back, is that we are based at 2 high schools in the region. So I don't know, like I'm a high school teacher, I'm a scientist, I am not an entrepreneur, and I am not a business person. And never in my life was like, oh, my dream, starting a seafood business. But I did think, I thought, oh, you know what would be really fun? What would be really fun is to work with a group of high school students to run a business. That would be a lot more fun than just running a business by myself. And so Fishadelphia, pre-COVID, was based at 2 high schools at Master E. Thomas in South Philly and Simon Gratz in North Philly. We ran after-school programming, and we still do. And the kids actually they were just meeting just now and maybe going directly from their meeting to this event. After school twice a week. And we work with the students to sort of run the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day operations of the program. And that includes designing the website, communicating with the customers, balancing the books, paying the bills, and making programmatic decisions. And then also in non-pandemic times, organizing the pickup, and then customers would come pick up their fish at the schools. We buy high-quality, sustainably harvested fresh fish. Oh, stop. There's an audio that I need to stop. I don't know how to stop this. Sorry, we're going to stop you just for a moment. Okay. And then we're going to go on to the next one. It'll be fine. In here, I do it this way. So here's some of our seafood that we've distributed: squid, porgy, scallops, fluke. And with every fish, we give a handout that says who caught the fish, who sorted, who processed it, who drove it to you, and then who sold it to you, including the young people. So we ran focus groups in spring of 2017, and then ran our first pilot season spring 2018. And then here we are a few years later. We also run community events. So this is when we took a school bus full of people to visit the Point Pleasant Fishermen's Co-op to see where the fish come from. And so where does the fish that we are selling and we are eating and we are cooking come from? And as you all know, here we are in a pandemic. And so we have adapted. We meet with our students online, as you can see. We're selling at farmers markets. So we were at the Mifflin Square Farmers Market this fall, and we hope to be again in the spring and summer and to branch out from there. And we developed a pretty interesting organic community network of customers who host coolers on their porches, and then their neighbors can come pick up fish from those unstaffed coolers. And then we also developed a mutual aid fund where people could donate money and people could request money, no strings attached. We have a handful of specific inclusion strategies that I thought would be of interest. There are things that we talk about, and we can talk about them within this broader discussion. We have a two-tiered price structure: a regular price, which is about $22 a week for a pound of fish, and then community rate, which is about $12 for the same amount of fish. You're eligible for the community rate if you send a student to one of our participating schools, and or are eligible for public assistance like food stamps, and or are referred to us by a customer who is also a community rate customer. We take a variety of payment options, and including, I think, so for example, the fact that we take cash is really important for reaching a diversity of customers. We're really intentional and thoughtful about where in the city we want to be and what institutions we want to partner with. It's part of why we were really intentional about partnering with schools, which are community anchors, where people who live in the neighborhood feel comfortable going to those places. We also use our student networks are really crucial for our success. So for example, we have a student who runs our WeChat group. WeChat, if you don't know about it, is a social media platform commonly used in China. And there's a host of Chinese moms and grandmoms who are on our WeChat group, and we sell a bunch of fish through that medium. We also do a lot of texting individually, which I think allows us to reach a different group of people than if we were just, for example, using email to communicate. Many of our customers subscribe for a full season, like a CSA or community supported agriculture model. People can subscribe for the full season in advance, but we also have a number of people who buy week to week, and I think that also allows us to capture a different group than we might otherwise. We run community events. As I mentioned, we take people to the shore, but we also bring people into the city. And the last event we did before the pandemic started in earnest was at the library in the amazing, I don't even know what it's called, the amazing kitchen space upstairs. And that was such a lovely event. So hopefully we'll get to do that again. And something that feels really important to us is that we are intentionally assets oriented, not deficits oriented. So we are not in the business of teaching people how to shop, how to cook, how to eat. If people have questions, we're happy to provide information about where fish has come from or how to handle it. But we assume that the people that we work with at all points in our supply chain have deep and historical cultural relationships with seafood. And our job is to provide the access to make that possible. We took our youth to visit our processing facility in Pleasantville, and they had a really nice time. And I am super excited for having a conversation with Sara.
Talia, thank you so much for sharing. And I realized that this is the first of our episodes where we've had visuals, and I remember why. It's dinner time, and now I'm like, fish. Sara, I'd like to pass it over to you, and I will share some of the slides that you shared with me. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with PASA.
Well, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I think Talia is a tough act to follow, so I will do my best. I'll sort of keep it short and simple. Basically, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my organization, PASA, and then a little bit about how I got here, because it has a similar theme to Talia's story, which is, for any students who are listening, I think we're both pretty good examples that you don't have to know exactly what you're going to do when you're 20 or 25. Life is a circuitous process, and sometimes you end up in great places through really strange paths. So I'm certainly an illustration of that. Next slide. Next slide. So I'll just tell you a little bit about PASA. PASA's been around for 30 years. It's a statewide Pennsylvania organization. It supports farmers, food system professionals who are anywhere in the whole food chain, and really concerned eaters is what we call them. We have 7,500 members, and then we have a lot more than that who sort of listen to our webinars and get our newsletters. And it's an organization that was born from farmers. It was organized by farmers, and it's really devoted to giving farmers a voice and connecting them to change makers, policymakers, and vice versa. You know, getting the word back to farmers if there are ways to help them do more supportive, sustainable, regenerative agriculture. So I think with that, I'll give you a very short, my circuitous bio here. I started out first job after college as a newspaper reporter, and I ended up at the Tampa Tribune, which is probably as close as I got to seafood. We were on the Gulf Coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and it was a time of great development of the coast. And so you had a fairly pristine coast that was being changed day by day by housing developments, canals, businesses, roads, things that really changed the nature of a very, very rural setting. And I think there were a number of reasons why. Florida's always had a history of rapacious development. It's been a place where dreamers and schemers and con artists are sort of pulled, but it has some beauty and real amazing wildlife and amazing resources, many of which are still there. But it got me thinking a lot about, you know, okay, I can write stories, but how can I save the coast? So I went back to school, and I went to forestry school, and I came out at forester, which is a little detour, but I was going to go back and write for the New York Times and save the coast. And then I got detoured a little bit because most of the jobs were in environmental work, and I ended up at the Environmental Protection Agency and saw sort of firsthand the workings of government. And it wasn't always pretty, but it was really interesting to me. And I thought, well, maybe this is what I should be doing, working that intersection between conservation and how you make a difference. And there's a whole lot of ways to do that. Talia's found her way. This was one way that I thought I could make a difference. Since that time, I've worked for a number of nonprofits. I had a lot of fun taking out small dams in Pennsylvania so that shad and other migratory fish could move. I think we ended up taking 60 or 70 small dams out, and these were little mill dams when the mill was gone. So basically they were not functioning except to block fish. So we liberated some of those systems, and I ended up at the state agency. I think Molly mentioned the conservation department. where work as a forester actually made sense, but again, was feeling that pull towards policy. How can we talk to state legislators? How can we talk to other agencies? How can we talk to the federal government and local representatives to make some changes that we would see affecting how we did business and how our constituents did business? Today with PASA, it's been a real joy to work directly with farmers. I feel that our policy work gives them a voice. Just in summary, to me, policy work is trying to fix things, to put it in the simplest possible language. You're often besieged by people with a problem. Okay, the streams are full of nutrients. I'm not getting the kind of government support I need to do better conservation work. These are all solvable problems. And so essentially I find myself at that intersection working on conservation, but trying to find those leverage points where you can make a difference. I wanted to tell you in the next slide, just a couple things that we're working on. One of those things is a soil health roadmap. Now, one of the best things about soil health is nobody's against it. A lot of issues have pros and cons. Everybody's for soil health. It's sort of a no-brainer. If you don't have healthy soil, your crops will suffer, your production will suffer, the environment will suffer. Your soil will end up in streams where it's killing all sorts of aquatic life. It will ruin water quality. It even affects air quality and how much nitrogen is volatilizing up into the atmosphere. Healthy soils capture more carbon, so it's a natural form of carbon sequestration. Planting trees in conjunction with covering the soil with cover crops such as this is a really good way to draw carbon down from the atmosphere and trap it and keep it in the earth. And there are many other methods that we promote with our farmer networks to improve soil health. One of those is no-till or conservation tillage, doing less plowing, which turns the soil up less, which doesn't send as much carbon and methane and nitrous oxides up into the atmosphere. So there are rotational grazing of cattle and pigs and sheep and other livestock is another good way to limit damage to soils. So we're promoting this through a roadmap that's going to come out next year. We're going to take it to legislators. We're going to share it. We're going to try to educate as many folks as we can and promote this sort of common sense kind of soil building methods that we know work. PASA does a lot of science and research on the ground with farmers, and we have been able to document the benefits of these practices. So next slide, please. Okay, this is my new favorite topic, which is combining solar with grazing. A lot of groups sort of consider solar and wind to be where we should be going, but please don't do it on farmland. Don't take farmland out of production. The problem is farms currently account for about 10% of all carbon emissions and even more other greenhouse gas emissions. So farming is part of the problem, but it's also a big part of the solution. If we can help farmers reduce their energy use, change it to non-fossil fuels like solar and wind, and combine it with their ongoing grazing operations. This photo is of the Dickinson College Farm in central Pennsylvania. It's about 10 miles down the road from me. I just spent a very happy afternoon. We're not really allowed to congregate as people, but they said there was no problem congregating with the sheep under the solar panels. They do very well. They keep the vegetation down. They manage it for the farm. The solar panels power just about everything on this farm, and it's compatible. There's really no displacement of production agriculture. So it's kind of growing. We're trying to bridge that divide between folks who say don't do anything on a farm, and other folks who would like to take over the whole farm and put 20 acres of solar panels in. So like everything else, there's a balance, there's a right way to do things, but we're pretty excited about this. I think I'll stop there and get back to our moderator.
And then sharing sheep, I mean, perfect. Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing some of your work. And I think it provides great context for why we were so excited to bring the two of you together, because there's so many threads of your work that, and Sara, thank you so much for noting that we can start off doing one thing in our careers and then we can end up doing something completely different. I am also proof of that. And we'll probably change again, who knows? But there's so many different threads that bring your work together. And the most obvious one, I think, is the fact that you're both connecting urban eaters and rural or shoreline producers. And Talia, you talked a little bit about how Fishadelphia is connecting those groups. And Sara, I know that PASA does that as well through its conferences and other events, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the why behind that. What should those groups know about one another that you think is important? And either of you can start. You can flip a coin.
I'll go quickly. I would just say that it sort of comes naturally to PASA. Our community is not sort of one or the other. We have rural farmers and we have urban farmers. We have rural eaters and we have urban eaters. And I think the places that they intersect, which I agree with you, should be much more often and more involved, are places like farmers markets. A lot of our members sell in urban areas and in rural areas to concerned eaters who want to know their produce is coming from a farm. They'd actually like to be out there looking at the farm and picking the produce sometimes. So I think the interest is there. I think the opportunity isn't always as available as it should be. I'm sure Talia has a lot to say on that, but I will say the other place that PASA pulls folks together are demonstrations, farm tours, interactions, webinars. We try to share with as broad a public as we can where food comes from, how it can be produced in the most sustainable and thoughtful and careful way. And I think there's a real hunger for that. I think people really are more and more interested in where their food comes from.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think that connecting urban and rural communities is one of the central and explicit missions of Fishadelphia. And I guess it's sort of interesting because I do think that our producers or our suppliers are predominantly rural and our consumers are predominantly urban, which makes it a little bit different from the way that PASA is sort of thinking and working on things. But I mean, I think that's sort of one of the most fundamental and interesting questions about this project for me, which is that, I mean, especially we're at a special political moment right now, but I think it's been true for a long time that rural and urban communities have been told that they don't have very much in common, that we don't have very much in common. And when I think actually we have much more in common than we might expect or think. And I'm really interested in what happens if we connect people through a commodity that everyone is interested in. I mean, in this case, that commodity is fish. I think you could choose your commodity of choice. But in this case, everyone is interested in fish, and does building a meaningful connection through a commodity that everyone is interested in have potential for increasing awareness of people who are connected by this commodity, increasing not just awareness, but knowledge of people along the supply chain? Does it, and then for me, the most interesting question is, does it then have potential to increase solidarity between these groups? And that for me is the whole question, the whole point. It's by far the most interesting thing. And so, yeah, so we take people on field trips, we take people to the docks, we take people to the shellfish farms, but we also invite our harvesters into the city to see what happens to the food that they produce. And one of the things that we've talked about internally, which is sort of interesting, is that sometimes it's hard to get people to move to a different place. And so one of the things that we also do is we make videos of the supply chain. So where does the fish come from, and then what happens to it at the other end, and what is the possibility of, if you can't bring people physically together, can you connect them through other ways? And we're sort of in a really special moment of learning how to connect people by video. And so we had like a Meet the Farmer event a couple of weeks ago, which I don't think would have been possible before we were all acclimatized to Zoom. And I think there's a lot of potential for that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I guess this is partly a question for Talia, and I'll explain it, is I don't know to the extent that it's easy to recruit new and young people into fishing. I know that the history of farming is pretty much, if you were not born on a farm, you were not going to be a farmer. And so many people left the farm, you know, at one point early in the 1900s, it was 80% of the public that farmed, and now it's 2%. So all of that food is coming from a very tiny group. One of the things that we try to do, and is exciting, I think, because it's the future of farming, is getting young people, and many of them are actually urban or suburban, interested in farming. And that's the new wave of the regenerative and sustainable farming world. These are earnest, really young, eager people that if they can find access to land, they are out there raising vegetables on 3 and 4 acres, which is enough actually to make a decent living. But I'd be interested to hear what's going on in the fish world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation on our supplier end of trying to get people into fishing, and shellfish farming also. And what does that look like? I guess I'm also really interested. One of the things we've been talking about internally is also not just the harvesting component, but also the processing component of it. And so one of the things we've been talking about is who does that processing labor? Where have they learned to do it? Who is likely to keep doing it in the future? Are there ways to make that also sustainable and to bring people in? Yeah.
And, you know, speaking of, and Sara, I'm glad that you brought it up, the drive for sustainable and regenerative practices and where that's coming from. I know that you both are thinking about that and environmental conservation in your work generally. And Sara, I'm wondering, in terms of your policy work, like what issues are at play right now in Pennsylvania? And what are the messages that you're hoping to communicate to consumers, whether they are urban or rural, when they're making their food choices?
Wow, that's a great question, and an all-encompassing question. So I'm probably not going to do it justice, but I'll give you a few thoughts. You know, the pattern of agriculture. I'll just talk about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has some 50,000 farms still in existence, but we lost 10% of those in the last 10 years. So there has been a relentless consolidation. Farms here are still mostly family farms, I think 97% of them. But what that means is different to different people. Some of them are bigger than you would think, and they don't quite evoke as pastoral, maybe a picture, but many of them are. So we have a good base, especially sort of compared to the Midwest, where, you know, farms are 5,000 acres. Ours average about 100 acres. So we have that network and we have that history. I think it is a policy question, because in the last 50 years, there has been this mantra from the federal government, you know, administration after administration. It's not really a partisan issue. It's more of a business model, which is go big or go home. And there are good operations of all sizes, but it really depends how they're set up. And so when it comes to conservation, I think a general rule is the more diverse you are, the better off your impacts are to everything else. Better for the animals involved, better for nature, better for streams, better for air quality, better for wildlife, and often not a bad business model, but it's going back to an earlier form of production that has not been as supported by federal and even some state policies. So we kind of like to go back and look at what used to work really well and see if we can't bring some of those concepts back. If not everything about it, it's probably unrealistic. Things are very mechanized compared to the old days. Not too many people farm with horses, although we have more of that than most states because of plains communities. So there's a really nice legacy here. We just have to learn what works from that and bring it back. And that's kind of what regenerative agriculture is. From a conservation standpoint, you know, I'm a forester, so I'm always saying, how many trees can we put in the ground? Can trees be integrated with crops, with grains, with animals? And these are not new ideas. These are ancient practices. And we've gotten away from a lot of that. So one of the things that we do at PASA with a lot of other good conservation groups is we promote agroforestry. And that's the intentional addition of trees with other things that you're doing on your farm. If you're doing that, trees and livestock, it's called silvopasture. If you're running apple trees with, you know, grains or vegetables, it's called alley cropping. These things are, you know, a blast from the past, but they're good ideas. They enrich the soil. In most cases, they give farmers a bit of a diversification of income as well. So you don't have all of your hopes on, you know, corn and beans. That said, the federal government does provide subsidies and crop insurance, which kind of change that business model a bit. So, you know, we're always trying to inject conservation where it works for the farmer, where it works for the environment, where it keeps people, you know, it's not an either or, where they can still make a living. So that's a rambling answer to a really good question.
No, that's a great answer. And I saw Talia nodding along a bunch, especially when you're talking about learning from legacy. And I wanted to kick it to Talia and say, you know, similarly, what have you been hearing from the fisheries community in terms of what they're thinking about conservation, or what you're thinking about in your work and in your research on conservation as it relates to the fish supply chain?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear about the different policies that PASA is enacting with its members. I think that our approach is really different in part. Well, I mean, it's a different landscape or seascape as you see it for so many reasons. But one of the things that's really interesting is that we live in a part of the world and a part of the country that has the resources to manage its wild caught fish species fairly well. So we operate under the assumption, which is scientifically based, that federally species of fish caught in federal waters, which is more than 3 miles offshore, and managed by the federal government, are sustainably managed. There's a huge amount of science and infrastructure that goes into that, and we defer to those people to do their job so that we can buy the fish. And I mean, I think that there's a lot of tension within the broader fisheries community that includes fisheries scientists and fisheries harvesters about what exactly is the right amount of fish to take out. How many fish do we get to take out and still have more fish in the future and also still have jobs, right? That's this enormous tension in fisheries science. And one of the things that is true is that we can mostly buy the fish and feel glad that people who are very well trained and thoughtful to wrestle with these issues are in fact wrestling with them, and setting limits and saying this is how much can be taken of these species, and then some of it comes to us.
That's so interesting because there's no such framework in agriculture. there's not even a sort of mechanism to prevent a glut in a famine situation. And yet I would assume that most of our farmer constituents would resent additional layers of regulation. So, it's a finite resource in a different sense, but not as well defined as yours.
Yeah, and the thinking back to Sarah's example of soils and maintaining soils, if the water is the medium in which all the fish live, and if the soil is the medium in which all of the plants grow, and the very different ways we have of managing those two. But what I also like that you both said, whether you thought that you said it or not, is that we are actually poised in our region to manage both of those mediums, those growing mediums, if you will, if we're paying attention. And I'm really glad that you're doing the work that you're doing. So I want to ask you more questions. I also want to invite folks to pop questions into the chat. Susanna, do we have any questions that we want to bring to the panelists at the moment? Susanna says we have one. While Susanna's pulling it up, I wanted to, and you touched on this before, and Sara, you didn't talk about this as much, but I know that part of your work is thinking about livestock and meat processing and very small meat processing. And so in some ways, you're both working in the animal protein supply chain, to give it a totally unsexy name. And I think when people traditionally think of local food, they're thinking of farmers markets and abundant tables of vegetables that came from nearby farms. And I'm wondering what both of you have found that is unique about animals and the protein supply chain, and what makes fish or beef or lamb particularly effective in building a regional food economy. And Talia, I think that you started saying this a little bit when you said that it's a commodity that everybody's interested in to start.
I think seafood is so interesting because people have such intense cultural relationships to it. So one of the courses I'm teaching this fall is on Black and Asian foodways. And we went around and talked about our relationships to fish growing up. How often did we eat it? What forms did we eat it in? And I don't know, the way that people were talking about eating fish sauce at every meal, or eating dried fish every morning. And that being a defining feature of the food that people grew up with. And I think it somehow evokes, I don't know, people who really like seafood are really into it and have a lot of opinions and want particular kinds in very particular ways. And I think for us, that means that this work is super interesting and allows us to connect people through their food cultures, through the ways that people grew up or the ways that people work in their homes right now, and also then connect that to the environmental contemporary. So for me, one of the things that's really interesting to think about is what we talk a lot about, what species are locally available. So people often say, well, do you have salmon or shrimp? And what I say is that, well, right, we don't have salmon or shrimp locally available, but we have a lot of other species. And so why is it true? Why don't we have salmon here? Why don't we have shrimp here? What is available here? And what is climate changing? What effects are the current changes in climate having on what is available here and at what times of year? And so I think it's the sort of remarkable vehicle for education and connection and thinking about where we come from and where we're going. I mean, not that vegetables aren't. I think vegetables are also great. Don't get me wrong, but seafood is just so interesting.
Well, I should put a plug in for vegetables here, but they're great. But it's funny. I have two daughters, and they're both, one's a vegetarian, one's a vegan, and they have been since about the age of 10. And so I can either say that I've enlightened them or I've failed miserably as a cook. So you all can decide. I'm not going to tell you which that is. There is a strong cultural aspect to meat as well. And Americans are sort of famous for eating a lot of meat. And it is kind of a challenge because what we promote is pasture-raised meat. We prefer to see pigs and cows and sheep and even chickens out and turkeys out, sort of being themselves to some degree, living an unconfined life, still with intentional management rotations. But it's healthier for the environment as well. You don't have big problems like manure storage that you have to deal with. You have fewer inputs, fewer chemicals going in to pasture conditions. So there's a lot of pluses for it. One of our researchers at PASA, Franklin Egan, did a study recently on what it would take to have every animal raised in Pennsylvania be pastured. And it turns out we would need double the current size of Pennsylvania. So there's a reason for confinement operations. They're more efficient. They can produce a lot more animals in a much smaller space, but there are some downsides to that as well. I would say not just for the animals, but for some of the processing situations. Molly asked a little bit about processing and protein, and she said I had full license to nerd out a little bit on what the processing world looks like in Pennsylvania, and I'll keep it brief because it's also dinner time. And honestly, as a forester, I never thought I would be involved in the animal processing world, but it is a fascinating world. It's a whole infrastructure that makes the rest of it possible. To take the animals from the pasture to your plate requires a lot of work and a lot of people. And I guess the short version is that we found out in the COVID crisis that it's a very vulnerable system, and it did fall apart to some extent, especially the large processing plants. Thankfully, we had a lot of small processors in Pennsylvania. We still do. We would like to support them, again, as the local option, not to have to take the animals as far. There's some definite benefits to doing things locally and on a slightly smaller scale, combined with treating the workers in the plants as well and paying them a living wage. So there certainly was exposed some vulnerabilities in the system. We're spending a lot of time trying to find the resource to shore those up and make it a better system, essentially.
Thank you both. I am going to head over to the chat and ask you some questions from participants. The first one I have is a question for Talia about interactions with Rebel Ventures. For those of you who are joining from beyond Philadelphia, Rebel Ventures is another youth-based food and food production initiative based here in Philadelphia. Their first product was a sort of kind of like if you picture a muffin, but without the stump, just the muffin top almost. And it's a product that they developed to be considered like a full reimbursable breakfast along with a carton of milk through the National School Breakfast Program. And one of their first large clients was the School District of Philadelphia. So Talia, have you worked with them or other youth organizations, knowing that your models are very different?
We certainly know about Rebel Ventures, and we have sort of crossed each other's paths a number of times at conferences and also in the city, and we would be super excited to work more with them. We have talked a lot about connecting with other youth programs like the Viet Lead Resilient Roots Farming Program and the Sankofa Farms at Bartram's Gardens. There are so many amazing youth food programs here. And I mean, it's sort of interesting. Like in some ways, this is the right, whatever. This is an opportunity. This moment is an opportunity to do more of that connecting, because again, we can just zoom everybody in a way that we might not be able to. Yeah, I think there's a lot to do and a lot of excitement around youth food programming here, and it would be fun to do more building with each other to the extent that we're able.
Yeah, and there's only so many Zoom meetings that one can be on during a day, but there is so much happening. And Sara, these are going to be, a lot of these people who are in these programs now might be your future farmers. So stay tuned for their showing up at PASA conferences. Going back to our conversation a little bit about soil and water, one of the attendees mentioned about Pennsylvania lagging in the Chesapeake Watershed Quality Project. And Sara, you started talking a little bit about confined feeding operations, and we know that they have a negative impact on water quality. And you mentioned nutrient runoff, and obviously that flows right into our fisheries areas. And so I'm wondering if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, well, this has certainly been an issue for a long time. I think the latest, I'm a policy nerd, so I like to throw numbers out, but I think agriculture in Pennsylvania of all types, with a lot of variation on the landscape, accounts for about 90% of the remaining runoff that goes to the Chesapeake Bay tributaries in Pennsylvania. So it's pretty well recognized as an issue. I would say there's two policy needs out there. One is, a lot of farmers are really busy people and they've got all kinds of stuff going on. They don't always know the latest sort of conservation techniques. So there's a real need for technical assistance, which is in short supply here in the state. And frankly, there's just a shortage of funding for this. I was part of a 2-year effort when I was at the Department of Conservation, along with Department of Ag and Department of Environmental Protection. The three agencies work with federal government and lots of nonprofit partners to come up with a giant plan. It's called the WIP3, Watershed Implementation Plan, which is a little wonky. But basically, it was trying to figure out, how do we fix this? We've been out of compliance for a long time. How do we get farmers the resources they need? And how do we get them to do these things on the landscape? And turns out the need financially between what we spend now on conservation on farms and where we need to be to fix these issues, for the most part, is a missing $340 million per year. So we have a job to get those resources to farmers, to hire more technical assistance folks. It's not rocket science. We kind of know what to do. We need to put more trees on the ground. We need to plant buffers. We need to put hedgerows back. We need to fix barnyards that are running into the stream. We have to get manure, apportioned in a better way. And we sort of know what to do. It's not always the political will to do it or fund it, but we're all working on that, and I hope we get there.
Another question for you, Sara, and this attendee mentioned that they've studied common pool resources around the world, including fisheries, and is wondering if the concept of resource ownership and how that plays a role in both farming and fisheries. Are there land tenure policies that PASA is advocating for, or any related policies or practices in the area of fishing?
I'll start, and I think Talia is going to have a lot to say on this. In a nutshell, land is the commodity that's in short supply. Access to land, especially for people of color, is a really hard thing. There's a whole history of stripping people from their land. There is a real need to diversify farming in general. But I would say that we're trying a couple of things. There are a number of groups like PASA, we're not the only one, looking for opportunities to bring young farmers to partner with retiring farmers to develop apprentice mentorship programs. We run one of those for vegetable operators, and we run one of them for grazers, folks who want to have pastured livestock. So that's one way to get people into the system. It's a really, really tough problem because the resources aren't always there. But another thing that we're exploring a lot and have done some work, and many others have, is co-ops. Co-ops are a grouping of farmers. They don't all have to be the same function. Some of them can be the folks who put the products into a jar as for sale. Some can be the cookers in the kitchens. You have a whole system of value added. And there are some really great examples of co-ops across Pennsylvania. I know there's some in Philly. Lancaster Farm Fresh is one of them, biggest in the state. And it spreads the risk, it spreads the rewards. It's a decentralized kind of system that we would love to see a whole lot more of.
I mean, right. I think the question of how to manage common pool resources is crucially central for fisheries management, but I do think that we're much less involved with that at a policy level compared to what Sara is doing at PASA. I guess I think I will say there are a lot of challenges of managing fisheries as a common pool resource in a sustainable way. And some of the, well, one of the challenges is that many of the rights-based management strategies like transferable quotas have resulted in a fair amount of ownership consolidation in the fleets, which has resulted in a lot of big corporations owning a lot of permits and then smaller folks having a harder time accruing enough permits to make it worthwhile to keep fishing. But I also think it's true that there are many examples of fisheries around the world, which presumably, and we can talk about in greater detail, being managed in ways that take into consideration the idea that it is a common pool resource and multiple actors are trying to access it, and it's possible to build systems that make that sustainable and don't involve running the resource to the ground. Yeah.
There's a question for both of you about reaching younger demographics. What do you think makes it harder to reach younger demographics in the work you're doing, and how can we break down some of the barriers?
I think Talia should go first on this one. She's done so much work on this.
I mean, I don't know. I love young people. I don't find them hard to access. They're super amazing and they do amazing things. And I think sometimes it's hard to keep young people involved in things. I mean, because we were all adolescent, and I don't know, just because of the way that adolescence works, but I don't know. Our young people are so amazing and inspire us all the time, and so we keep coming out of meetings with them and like, they're so awesome. So that's been really great. And I guess it's been sort of interesting when we ask our students about why they're involved in our program, almost all of them say that they want to learn what it means to run a business or how to run a business. And then sometimes I laugh because I'm like, I don't, you're trying to learn a business from somebody who's a scientist and a teacher. I don't know that that's your best move, but okay, we'll do our best together. We'll figure it out. And then in so doing, then we also get to learn together about more about food, more about seafood, more about the environment through the guise of theoretically learning how to run a business. So I don't know if that really got to the question. I'd be happy to talk about it more. And maybe Sara has, and I think maybe Sara has more to say about recruiting young farmers, which I think is sort of a little bit of a different issue.
Yeah, that's really all I have to offer. We have apprenticeship programs. We have a pre-apprenticeship program now, which gets kids straight out of high school. You know, it's a hard sell. I think, again, 100 years ago, half the kids in the country were going to go into farming, and that isn't true anymore. And so when you're far away from where your food is produced, and, you know, frankly, there are some it's hard work. It doesn't present itself as an obvious career path. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, we do have these wonderful young people who are just bound and determined to go into farming. So it's got some appeal. And I think to the extent that we can lower the barriers, like access to land, like the institutional knowledge through mentorships, nobody can sort of take a short course and become a farmer any more than they probably could be a fisherman. It takes experience, and it takes experience with someone who knows what they're doing. They're both fairly dangerous, can be dangerous occupations. So, and, you know, I was looking at the apprenticeship roster of trainings that we do and others do, and it's like 30 jobs rolled into one. You have to learn probably the same in this shipping and fishing world. You have to repair equipment. You have to be able to fix your tractor. You have to hotwire your fences. You have to know marketing and management and labor management and pesticide application and fertilizer application and something about animal husbandry so your sheep don't die. I mean, there's just so much to it. So I think it appeals to a young person that loves the breadth of knowledge and wants to be hands-on and try everything. And if you'd really rather be, you know, a doctor or a lawyer, I think it would drive you crazy, and it probably wouldn't suit as well. But I think to a certain kind of young person, it's a great challenge.
I think hearing about that reminded me that one of the great inspirations for this program, and they're doing something on a whole different scale than we are doing, coming even close to doing, is this amazing youth-oriented organic farm program in Hawaii called Ma'o. And they do an amazing youth program, and they partner with the community college to train a cohort of students every season, many of whom become full-time employees. And so I've thought a lot about, like, what does it mean to train our students, and then can we then offer them jobs in a way that is sustainable after they are students with us? And I think we're still trying to figure that out. I mean, what does it mean to have I mean, we have hired some of our former students. They are now staff with us, but what does it mean to be working for a quirky, idiosyncratic community seafood program that is still trying to figure everything else out while we're for the first time, right? So like, it doesn't, I still haven't figured out the job security part for offering, I mean, for all of us, and also for all of our future students who might want to work with us in the future. But I think that's part of the project, but certainly that is part of the hope, right? That, and I guess, I think to get at that question, I mean, we do financially compensate our young people for being involved with us, but I guess one of the things that we found is that that is important, but it's not the most important thing, and it's not enough. And that students become involved with us. I mean, I think it helps many of them that they get paid for their time, but it's certainly not the only reason that they're showing up. And there are a lot of other reasons why they might or might not want to participate in these kinds of programs.
I would say 100% for our work. And we also share the struggle of how you place people that have gone through this program, and you know, you want them to instantly start farming, and some of them do find opportunities because people are always, again, looking to sort of continue the operation if their children have gone off and done other things, but it's no guarantee. It's not easy. And I think it's a challenge in any field. It certainly is in conservation when you get young people interested in building trails and planting trees and picnic tables and lean-tos, and, you know, and then where do they go? And that is our economy right now. So I think it's hard, but I think those skill sets and that passion is also important. Knowing you can do something, and hopefully as they become adults, they care more about what happens in our fisheries and what happens on our farms, and are educated people who care. So even if they don't end up in that exact field, I think they're better for it.
We have a couple more questions and only a couple more minutes. And a quick question for Talia about the product being sold. Is it all sourced through aquaculture? Is there anything from land-based or indoor recirculating systems?
So I would say all of our fish with fins, as opposed to shellfish, that's an in-industry term. All of our finfish is wild harvested because that's what is available in New Jersey. And then we buy both oysters and clams that are farmed, but they're farmed out in the ocean. Right? So like this, they were seeded, sometimes they're seeded in cages, sometimes they're seeded in beds that are that people have rights to. So, but we are not currently buying from any indoor land-based recirculating systems, although we did just have a conversation about that in our staff meeting on Friday. And I mean, certainly there's potential there, but I think one of the sort of initial thrust of the project involved connecting with the existing wild harvested fisheries. Sometimes people ask us, oh, do you go catch the fish? And I'm like, no. We pay the professionals to catch the fish and we buy their fish. That's how this works. So yeah, and I'm happy to talk more about sourcing.
In the moments that we have left, there's a question to Sara about PASA's connection and connecting rural farmers and urban farmers in ways that aren't related to policy, events, parties, things like that. And I wanted to kind of ask that and leave an opportunity for Sara and Talia for you to do one or two or both things. One, tell us something that's coming up for you that people should know about. Or two, tell us how COVID has changed how you interact with people. I don't care which one you want, whatever one you want to end on. So Sara, starting with you, connecting rural farmers and urban farmers, how's PASA doing it and what do you want to share to close us out?
Well, I think I can combine what's coming up with that question. We have an annual winter conference. We've had them for 30 years. Sadly, this one will be virtual, but it's packed with all kinds of stuff. You'll still get to see, sheep in action, and you'll get to hear from experts on how to trim their orchards, and just a huge number of topics. And we're trying to make it as interactive and fun as we can. So I don't know if this is probably not the best way to do that. I'm pretty low tech. I'll see if I can chat it out. But if you go to www.pasafarming.org, and you will find all the information, and then registration is open now. We have some fabulous speakers, national figures. Our keynote is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, which is an incredible story of her life and indigenous farming. I think that'll be a highlight. But that is the way we get people together from all walks of life. If you go to a PASA conference, and last year we had more than 2,000 people, you will bump into every conceivable aspect of agriculture, including my particular favorite is the innovation corner, where people are coming up with new ways to harvest elderberries and turn them into wine, like in one machine. It's just really creative, fun, great networking. We have a lot of Plain Sect community members who come, and gives it a little different flavor. We have people from all over. So we, that's the way we mix folks, in addition to the webinars, the conferences, the farmer to farmer in-field meetings. So I'll leave it at that.
And I did put those links in, and I will say that going to a PASA conference feels like going to a high school reunion that you actually want to go to.
Thank you.
Talia, how about you?
I was just thinking about what we've got coming up in the next year. I mean, it's a little bit hard to know what the year will hold on so many levels. But we're planning our spring season. You can sign up to get fish at more than 15 locations around the region. And I think we piloted this fall a new oyster club where you get oysters every month from local oyster farms, and we're going to be doing that again, and maybe sampling from more farms coming up. And then we're hoping to break out into more farmers markets, because farmers markets are a thing you can do socially distanced in the late spring, early summer. And I think the thing that, COVID has been so hard for so many reasons, and we have tried to look for, silver linings isn't quite the right word, but tried to find opportunities in these hard times. And it turns out it's been a really interesting place to think about how do we build a network, and how do we grow it, and how do we connect with people in these hard times. And I have hopes that we will continue to do that coming up.
That's a great place to leave it. I want to thank you, Talia and Sara, both of you, for joining us. And I'm going to kick it over to Susanna to close us out.
Thanks so much, Molly and Talia and Sara. We so appreciate all of the audience members as well as the panelists who have joined us over this 6-set series. And we have shared the link in the chat in terms of how to watch the recorded sessions. And we also have some other opportunities that are going to come out of this, including a zine that's going to be here at the Free Library of Philadelphia that's going to feature all of these amazing conversations. And I would just encourage everyone that's on the call today to follow these projects that we've been able to feature. I'll also just put in a really quick plug for the Free Library of Philadelphia. If you go to freelibrary.org/exhibitions, you'll be able to see some of the projects that I'm involved with, which, believe it or not, take on a very similar collaborative approach, and really invite all of you to really think about the types of special collections that we have at the library, and the types of special collections that you have in your own homes, and really think about the storytelling that's possible when we connect these kinds of materials with everyday lived experiences. So I just want to thank you again, and special shout out to Molly for being able to do this series. It's really wonderful when we can work with the health department and really bring this work forward. Thank you again.
Thanks, Susanna. Thank you all. Enjoy your dinner. Happy New Year.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.